I have to admit that when I first watched the Zeitgeist Moving Forward documentary, there were a few concerns that I had. Then I realized that the Venus Project advocates for non-aggression. Finding this out was a breath of fresh air. At least we can agree that we should not use violence to force people to go along with the societal organization we advocate. I'm all for testing theories out in the real world, but until then, we need to rely on logical deduction. Let's go over some of the economic arguments in the documentary. The one that seems to keep happening over and over again throughout the film is equating what is currently happening under state-controlled economies with what would happen in a free market economy. This is a blatant non sequitur. For example, the film explains how state-controlled currency is nothing more than debt, and the inherent process within its creation will inevitably lead to a small group of people owning all the wealth. And then it seems to conclude that state-controlled currency is not the problem, but rather money itself is the problem. This is incorrect. In a free market, money is merely a representation of value in a market. It is not a Ponzi scheme to fraudulently amass property as state-controlled currency is. Real money serves two extremely valuable functions in an economy. The first function is a medium of exchange. Just like how liquid water facilitates the growth of biological life, money facilitates trade, and thus the growth of an economy. The second function that money serves is calculation. Without money, you cannot calculate profit and loss. Without being able to calculate profit and loss, it becomes impossible to allocate resources in the most efficient way. For example, let's say that a car costs 10 ounces of gold, and it would cost you 5 ounces to produce it. The fact that you'll make a 100% profit on your investment is the market's way of telling you that producing the car is the most efficient way to use those resources, as opposed to using those resources to make something else. The calculation problem is not how to create a car, it is whether you should use the scarce resources of steel, aluminum, carbon, rubber, plastic, and so on to make a car or to make something else, or whether you should use more scarce resources to make the car more efficient at the expense of making something else less efficient, or the opposite. Without being able to measure the wishes of consumers and the merit of entrepreneurial propositions against the limitless ways of allocating limited resources, which is what money does, then it becomes impossible to allocate those resources in the most efficient way. The only response that I seem to get from this extremely crucial point is that people could give surveys as to how they want current resources to be allocated, and then finding some kind of average among the surveys. This would be impractical, to the point of being impossible. And even if it were possible, the data derived from these surveys would not be as accurate and up-to-date as the data derived from prices. Imagine that tomorrow you get an email from the Venus Project Global Resource Management System that we shall lovingly call HAL 9000. And the email lists all of the Earth's resources, and then all of the things that we have thus far figured out how to produce with these resources. And then HAL 9000 asks you for a priority list of what you would like to see produced, how many, in what form, and so on, with these limited resources in mind. HAL 9000 then collects all of the emails, averages out all the priority lists, and then proceeds to produce those particular things. There are many problems that I see with this idea. First of all, this would be an amazingly daunting task for any one person to do, let alone all of the people within the entire society. And the variables of technology, preferences, and the Earth's resources change every single minute of every single hour of every single day. Who would want to spend every single minute of their lives continuously taking and retaking surveys? Compare this amazingly complex and laborious process in a moneyless society to simply buying or selling something in a society that does have money. Another obvious problem that I see with that is that this process of taking surveys has no way of filtering out those who are not very good at guessing how to allocate resources and filtering in those who are good at guessing how to allocate resources. Instead, it just goes with the average of everyone's guesses. In a society with money, this problem is solved very easily. Scarce resources go through a bidding process. Each person makes a guess about which good fashioning that resource into will give them the most profit, and thus they are willing to bid on that resource up to the level at which they believe they can still make a profit. Inevitably, the resource will go to the highest bidder, who obviously believes he knows the most efficient way to allocate that resource. Otherwise, he would not have bid that high. If he ends up being continuously wrong, then he will continuously lose money to the point of not being able to bid on the resource anymore, and not being able to find anyone who will trust his business strategy enough to give him a loan. Without prices, not only is it impossible to have this evolutionary process of selecting the best people to make the decisions of how to allocate resources, it is also impossible to calculate if a bad decision has been made in the first place, short of mass starvation. Okay, that's enough of the calculation problem for now. Another economic argument that the documentary makes is that the market is incentivized to intentionally make products that break down so that customers will continually repurchase the product from them. Now, this may very well be true in this corporatized market, thanks to all of the government-created barriers to entry that make competition impractical and illegal, but it is wrong to think that this is what will happen in a free market. Think about it. Let's say that the current automobiles tend to break down and need to be replaced about every 10 years, and a car producer has found a way to create cars that will last indefinitely for around the same production cost. Other than the government, what is to stop the car producer from marketing these long life cars and grabbing a huge chunk of the car market? Either I, as a new car producer, can intentionally keep the lifespan of my cars low so as to hopefully get more repeat business, but at the risk of not getting any customers in the first place, since I now have nothing differentiating my cars from all of the rest, or I can lower my repeat business but dramatically increase my sales and then just move on to another market sector once sales die down. Let's say that I create the perfect book. Now, would the fact that no other book I write will ever be better than it mean that I am now incentivized to never market the book in the first place? Of course not. It is profitable to use this strategy intentionally of intentionally building your products to break down only if you have a monopoly. Otherwise, your customers will choose to buy from someone else. And you can only get a monopoly through bribing politicians to create barriers to entry, which would, by definition, no longer make it a free market. Another issue the documentary jumps on quite a bit is equality. Again, it is logically invalid to look at the obvious inequality in this government-controlled economy and conclude that this same inequality would happen in a free market. No, the ridiculous amounts of inequality we see right now are precisely because of government intervention in the market that has given political favors to particular businesses that allow them to monopolize a market sector and thus have a huge amount of artificial leverage to hold down employee wages and increase their product prices. Not even to mention the absolutely absurd amounts of wealth inequality that is created through the Federal Reserve and the fractional reserve banking system having artificial interest rates and inflating the government's currency. In a free market, not only will you have a stable money supply with real interest rates, but you will not have a government that creates barriers to entry, and thus it will become impossible for monopolies to form, and therefore you will have employee wages continuously going up, thanks to competing employers, and prices continuously going down, thanks to competing sellers. Thus, wealth will be far more evenly distributed in a free market than it currently is under this corporatized market. That isn't to say that wealth will be perfectly equal among everyone in a free market, but I don't think that the statistics the documentary showed about crime and so on were necessarily reflecting the result of an unequal distribution of wealth, but rather the result of an obviously rigged and unfair distribution of wealth. I doubt you will find as many people feeling that someone producing more value does not deserve more compensation. Instead, it is when someone who is not producing more value, but is still receiving an absurd amount of compensation, that people begin to become enraged. Another argument that was made is that it's more efficient to recycle everything than to start from scratch. This is demonstrably untrue. If it would cost more resources to recycle something than the amount of resources that it would cost to obtain new resources, then it is objectively less efficient to recycle. And as resources become more and more scarce while technology becomes more and more advanced, then the scales will tip to the other side and make recycling the more economical option. But not until then. This is a perfect illustration of why we need a price system. Because without a price system, these true but counterintuitive economic calculations would be completely ignored. The film also talks about the horrors of consumerism. how businesses will make brand names and advertisements that actually create an artificial demand for overpriced products that nobody really needs. Now, first of all, let me point out that these million-dollar handbags are a reflection of the situation we are currently in, with a small group of people owning the majority of the wealth. Something I've already explained would not happen in an actual free market. Second, a large amount of this consumption culture we have is directly due to our Keynesian government creating all of these artificial incentives to spend our way deeper and deeper into debt. Imagine if I were to give you a credit card with a limit of infinity, and then told you that you could buy whatever you want and don't worry about paying it back. Of course, you would be incentivized to spend a lot more money, and thus this government-created artificial demand for consumption creates a scenario where businesses are more than happy to meet this artificial demand for stuff that people don't even need. But this is an artificial demand created by the government holding fallacious Keynesian policies. Third, it's easy to think up solutions to this problem in a free market, such as advertising being almost completely done away with, and instead people would subscribe to ratings agencies that would review the cost and quality of the goods and services that businesses offer, thus taking the psychological influence out of the game quite a bit. But ultimately, this is an intellectual problem, not an economic one, and so long as parents had the demand for schools that would teach their children critical thinking skills, the profit-seeking schools would teach these skills to the students, and thus creating a new generation which would probably focus much more on technological progress and charity rather than unneeded consumption. The documentary also argues that technology creates unemployment. I can understand how easy it is to think this. After all, when we see a worker being replaced by a machine, it's obvious that the worker was laid off. But it's not so obvious. What's not so obvious are the new jobs that open up in an economy thanks to the improvement in technology. For over a century, we have created machines that dramatically improve the productivity of workers, machines that allow one single person to accomplish things that would otherwise require hundreds or thousands of people, and at the same time, we've experienced a huge surge in our population. If the theory that technology creates unemployment is true, then we should be experiencing 99.999% unemployment. Machines are really good at physical labor, but us humans are really good at cognition, creativity, art, design, writing, philosophizing, and so on. And so the more machines take over doing the monotonous and laborious tasks, the more the door will open for us to focus on what we do best. And just because a machine might do better at laborious tasks than humans does not mean that it is always more economical to have a machine do those tasks. This is, once again, a perfect illustration of the bad assumptions made when there is no ability to calculate whether it is more efficient to produce something in a more or less capital-intensive way. Now, it could very well be possible that someday robots will develop artificial intelligence that is superior to our intellectual abilities in every single way, and then they declare war on all humans and exterminate us. But hopefully, that's not going to happen anytime in the near future, and until then, I think it's safe to say that us humans will continue to find things to occupy ourselves with. And lastly, the film argues that the unprecedented growth in wealth that we have seen in the past century is not due to markets, but is rather due to oil and science and technology. This is like me saying, "I didn't shake your hand, my hand shook your hand." Of course, oil and science and technology had a profound impact on growing wealth. But what was behind these innovations? The pursuit of profit. Before J.D. Rockefeller found out that oil will have an enormous impact on offering our society cheap energy, oil was just thrown out. It was garbage. It was muck, as people thought. But Rockefeller, wanting to be as efficient as possible due to his incentive to gain the highest profit, found hundreds of different ways to use this stuff. It was the pursuit of profits that helped people to figure out that the division of labor will help a society become more efficient and produce more stuff. It was the pursuit of profit that helped individuals to build more and more capital so that our society can become more and more productive and increase the standard of living for everyone through lower prices and higher incomes. The more our society embraces the principles of voluntary interaction and private property, the more progress we have and will make.